So, welcome. And I thank you so much for joining us tonight on this, just really important topic about the SATs and the ACT. Where are we in the midst of this pandemic madness? And we have an expert, Jen. I'm not going to K-Fish. Am I saying K?
Nailed it. That was good. Yeah.
You're right. Okay.
You got it.
Thank you. I was brave on that one. Um, and the reason why I have Jen with us tonight is because she is an expert in the field in test prep here in LA, but she's been doing it for 15 years. I've worked with her for a couple, and I'm just, very impressed, mostly with her approach to the whole testing process, which is something that she and I share, the philosophy of testing and your students. So to me, there are two things that are really important. One is she doesn't believe in a one-size-fits-all approach to prepping for the SAT and the ACT. And she really believes in working with a student's strengths, and that helps them do better on the exams. So, and I believe that myself too. When you start working with me in a year from now on the writing process, that's how I approach that as well. And then second of all, we both really believe that your high school students are high school students. They've had a rough year doing everything online. We're fingers crossed, toes crossed that everyone's going to get back to school in the fall. But we understand that the testing piece of it is a piece of the puzzle. And even for some schools, colleges may not even be a piece. So we put it in perspective. I like to keep it in perspective. She keeps it in a proper, healthy perspective. And I appreciate you taking the time, Jen, to be here a second time with my families and for sharing your expertise with them. So without further ado, I give you my friend, Jen.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for making it tonight. I'll try to be as efficient and effective with our time and cover as much as we can. And if there's questions, Jennifer, do you want to have them do it in chat and do it as we go, or at the end? What's better, do you think?
What works best for you? I liked how you sectioned it out and then asked for questions.
Perfect. Yeah, let's just do that again. That works perfectly. So, okay. So before we do anything else, I want to go over a couple terms that I'm going to be throwing around, and you're going to hear a lot from colleges, which are test optional and test blind, and understanding what these mean. Now, I believe most of you are sophomores, and I think we've got a junior or two, but looking at kind of what this means for you guys also year by year is a little different. So test optional means that it is an option to test in theory, right? What that means is if it's going to benefit you, you include a test. If it's not going to benefit you, you may not. However, a lot of students are like, great, then I won't take it, right? If it's optional and I can bow out, I'll do that. Here's the thing, it depends on where you're applying, because if you are significantly above average on GPA, you cured cancer over the summer, you have all these amazing things going on, then maybe you don't need to test, especially if you're a weak tester. It may not help your application, we can leave it off. But for most kids who are applying to reach schools and dream schools, they're a little bit below average or even average for GPA at that university. So I always point out, especially top universities, but you can be a 4.8 GPA student and applying to Stanford, you're average, right? So it doesn't matter, everything's relative. But if you are not significantly kind of higher than what they're looking for in other areas, you want to test, because you need to give them a reason to say yes, not another reason to say no. So if you're below average on certain things, make sure testing is your opportunity to stand out. Now, when you're talking about test optional schools, there's two types in my mind. There are the kinds that are truly test optional, and those are the schools that were doing this before COVID. Right? There are some schools that really want to see if it's a strength, go ahead and send it. It's like an art supplement, right? So if you are a great artist, send your art supplement. If you're a terrible artist, art supplement won't help your application. They view testing the same way. Those are not as common. There are plenty of schools that do that, but it's not the most regular way to kind of approach it. COVID has obviously impacted it, where test optional became such a big thing because students could not test. So schools were leaving it up to students going, if you can test, we'd love to see it. If you can't, don't worry about it. So here's the thing, if you're a junior, you're likely to have pretty much all of your schools be at least test optional this coming year. And we'll talk about test blind in a second, but this coming fall, that's gonna be the most likely thing just because there's still so many issues with testing. There may be some that require it because as things open up, so don't assume you're going test optional everywhere, but you're likely to have that option. Sophomores, as sophomores, you do not necessarily have that luxury. All right, so if COVID magically disappears, everything is great, right? When we go into the fall, you have a full year to test. Colleges know that. There's a good chance you're going to go back to having tests required. So just know that just because the school is optional right now, they may not be by the time you apply, and they may, because a lot of schools are saying, look, we're treating this as a kind of a trial run. And if we like the class we get from a test optional standpoint, that'll work. Now, there are schools like University of Chicago. I always want to point them out because they went test optional a couple of years ago. They're a top 10 university. They're extremely competitive. And when they went test optional, everyone got really excited. But here's the fun story about that. They went test optional. Their acceptance rate plummeted because more people were applying, which drove up their ranking in the US News and World Report. And their average scores went up when they went test optional. So for the average accepted scores, it doesn't necessarily mean we don't care. It's partially sometimes an advertising campaign where colleges can say, look, anyone can apply. Don't worry if you're a bad tester, because it helps them statistically. So just know that every once in a while, if you look at schools like that, those are always considered iffy test optional. They'd still always prefer to see the kid with good scores. Now, test blind. Test blind really right now are just going to be the Cal States and some of the UCs. So this is something that, again, is in flux. Everything's changing constantly. I don't know how much any of you have followed this, but last May, the UCs announced they were going to go test optional for 2 years, then test blind for 2 years, then implement their own test, which I think is the most preposterous thing ever because it defeats the purpose of having tests or getting rid of tests. But that was their game plan. Then they started getting sued over still being test optional because it was discriminatory against students with disabilities who couldn't test during COVID. So with all these lawsuits and back and forths, the UCs finally were like, fine, we're test blind, we're not even gonna look at them. And that's what this means, is that if you get a perfect 1600, you cannot submit it to the UCs or Cal States. They will not look at them. All right, the thing is, that was this past year. This coming year, the Cal States are going to be test blind. Only a couple UCs have announced they're going to be test blind. Again, some are still considering going back to test optional, but do know that if your schools are primarily Cal States and UCs and you're a junior, you may end up in a position where none of them are even looking at scores, or you may in a position where only a couple campuses do. That's up in the air. If you're a sophomore, it's almost definitely going to be all test blind because that was the original plan by your grade. So just something to keep in mind. But when you're looking at schools, again, test optional, test blind, just make sure you understand the difference. And it's really what they can see and what they actually want to see. Any questions on that, on test optional, test blind stuff?
No.
All good? Awesome. Okay. So on that note, when we're talking about why not to go the test optional route and avoid sending scores, and everyone, of course, wants to avoid the headache of testing, the reality is testing is more important now than ever before, because imagine being in admissions trying to differentiate between applicants. This is something, we have somebody on our staff who's worked in UC admissions like UCLA, and she goes, we got 150,000 applications. These are all kids whose all their activities were canceled. She's like, we have grades are all from online school. We don't have test scores. Everyone kind of looks the same. So for the schools that are accepting them, this is something that you are going to be just seeing. Sorry, I just saw the comment saying Cal State's being test blind. Correct. That's what I was saying, is that Cal State's for you guys and most of the UCs, if not all the UCs, will be test blind for your grade. That, making sure, just backtracking on that. Everybody's good. Okay. So anyway, so back to why it's important. If you are them and you're trying to differentiate between students, think how hard it is without concrete data. Because a 4.0 at one school, we all know, is not the same as a 4.0 at another school. And there's sometimes you get a challenging teacher, you had one bad assignment, something went wrong. But especially with all this virtual and online learning, there are schools where most of my students are like, look, we have recorded lectures, we have 2.5 hours of class a day, and the tests are open book tests. We have other schools that are almost the opposite, which are harder than they've ever been. The students are up till 2 a.m. every night trying to do their work, and grades are really challenging. Colleges need to understand which A's mean what, and that's where standardized testing really comes in, right? It helps you compare apples to oranges and understand a 4.0 at this school, how does that relate to a 4.0 at that school? How does this student really prepare? What have they actually mastered? So obviously Jennifer will be working with you on how you round out, your activities and your essays and all of the stuff that's going to make you a more impressive and interesting candidate. But giving them concrete data right now, when a lot of people aren't and they don't know how much to trust your grades, it's big. So if you can use this to your advantage, which would be the thing I keep saying, testing should be something that with effort, everyone can get to a point where this is beneficial and you can help your application with this. Now, SAT and ACT. Let's talk for a sec about the differences. SAT, for those of you who took SAT back in the day, I don't know how much you've watched and are seeing announcements. They have changed the structure and format of this test so many times over the last 15 years. It was, 1600 scale pretty much was what it was for 50 years. And then all of a sudden in 2005 and 2006, there were changes. 2011, there were changes. 2016, there were big changes. So this test keeps just evolving, and in some ways in a good way, and in other ways not so great for students. This last change in 2016, their goal was to become a test that is hard to prep for. They succeeded to a certain extent because the goal is they have questions that are what's the best answer. ACT we'll talk about is what's the right answer. So on the SAT, they may have questions on the reading section that are like, one could infer that in a different scenario, this character would do which of the following, where there's not a firm right answer that you can find in the text, but maybe A is a little better than C. So the SAT is much more kind of manipulative is not the right word, but tricky, right? It's after you. So keeping that in mind, ACT is super straightforward. It just moves a lot faster. So ACT on a reading comprehension question, you're more likely to get somebody or a question that will say, where did red squirrels make their homes in the winter? Line 27 will say red squirrels lived in the treetops in wintertime. And that's your answer, but it moves faster. So ACT is all about pacing. And when people ask if colleges will take or accept both or whether they prefer one or the other, they don't. They acknowledge that they test different skill sets. Both test whether you know the material. SAT is testing more how you think on a certain level, but ACT is testing your ability to recall and to kind of speed read and things like that that are very relevant to life in college. So every college in America is going to let you pick which test you take. You want to pick the right one, and I cannot stress this enough. The number of times I've seen students who decided to go with SAT because they did well on the PSAT, or their parents took it, or their friend liked it, and it doesn't play to their strengths, it can be a very frustrating road. ACT, kind of similarly, if you are a student who needs time to really let things just marinate and think about topics and reread a passage, you get 50% more time on average per question on SAT. So it gives you that extra time, but it's trickier, right? So it's just weighing your options and figuring out which one is going to be better for you and your strengths. The ACT also has a science section, and this is a section that scares off a ton of kids and should not. This is the biggest thing we're always trying to emphasize to kids who push towards SAT. Because of this, science section is simply testing your ability to read graphs and charts and interpret data. Out of 40 questions on the science section, 2 maximum are allowed to be outside knowledge questions, and those are middle school science questions. It's your gas, liquid, solid. One of the ones that cracked me up recently is there was a question about the order of planets, and none of my students knew it. I was like, but you learned it in 2nd grade. I was like, so technically that was fair game. So there's every once in a while something like that. But again, that's absolute max. 2 of the 40 questions can be like that. The other 38 will always be in the graphs and charts in front of you. So they intentionally will give you questions that talk about, very fancy technical terms in science, and students start to freak out. They're like, I don't learn that. Or even worse, I kind of remember some of that from biology. What exactly is a genome again? They don't care. They're not testing that. So my number one thing when students are taking this is to think like a 7th grader. I was like, if you're trying to use high school science to solve this, you're doing it wrong. It's about, if you don't know what that word is, call it Steve, call it Frank. It doesn't matter. We don't care what the term means. We care about looking on the graphs and charts and seeing which bird flew farther in the spring. That's it. Okay. So when you have this balance of SAT or ACT and trying to figure out which plays to your strengths, I think another thing to keep in mind is extended time. And if you have any accommodations with College Board, which does SAT and APs, things like that, that's great. But those tests, the extra time helps a little bit for sure. It doesn't necessarily help a ton because it's so much trickier. So now thinking about ACT, this is a timing based test, right? The challenge is the pacing. If you get extended time on the ACT, you're home free. That is your test, almost no exceptions, because you just got rid of the entire challenge of the test, which was the pace and the speed. Okay, so just something to think about if you do have accommodations, but they are harder to get for ACT. So be prepared if that's the test you decide to pursue and you have an IEP or a 504 at school and get extra time or have any sort of accommodations at school, you need to have documentation from doctors and teachers in your school to support all of this. They oftentimes reject people the first time through and you have to appeal. But at the end of the day, it's worth it if you get it. But also recognize that it's not a guarantee. Just because you get it on SAT does not mean you'll necessarily get it for ACT. Any questions on that part?
There was a question in the text box, it's kind of going back a second, about what's the timing for each test?
So the total length is almost identical. And the sections, so one of the things that's different is that the SAT has a much longer reading section from a time standpoint, because they give you more time per question. It's nearly the same amount of questions. It's a little bit more, it's like 10 more questions, but a lot more time. The math on SAT, another big difference, which we didn't talk about, is there's a calculator section and a no calculator section. ACT, you can always use calculator. So SAT has 2 shorter math sections. ACT has 1 longer one. It's 1 60-minute math section where the other one's like 35 minutes here. And so it's smaller bite-sized pieces for math on SAT, but the reading is longer. So it's just a trade-off. But at the end of the day, you're looking at roughly 3.5 hours for the tests. A tiny bit less if you have somebody not giving you your full breaks. And if you do an essay for the ACT, and we'll talk about the SAT essay in a second, if you do the essay for the ACT, it's definitely something, it adds like 40 minutes to the test. It's not the end of the world. But the reality is they got rid of the SAT essay this year as of like a few weeks ago. So they're going to be discontinuing it, I think, in June. That is something that now you don't even have to worry about taking. Great. I think ACT is not going to be far behind, to be honest, on that one, because it's all their business competitors, right? So if they want to stay competitive, they're going to have to drop it too to make kids want to take it. But I also say, in the meantime, if you're a strong writer, take it, right? Do the essay portion. If this is something that, again, can give colleges more positive additional information about you and it's still available, do it. If you're a terrible writer, then take advantage of the fact that it's probably not going to be required anywhere by the time you apply. So that's just something about the essays as well. Any other questions about the differences between SAT and ACT? All good? Okay. Okay, so we talked about accommodations and extended time and just making sure that you are being kind of on top of this and proactive. You do have to sign up or register for what it's worth. So if you are eligible, they're not going to go through your paperwork until you've paid them. So if you want ACT or SAT to approve you, you have to register for a test date down the line. And you may end up throwing that $70 away, or you could end up picking a date far enough out that you may actually take that date. It just depends on how you want to handle it, but you will need to do that to get everything approved. They won't look at your stuff otherwise. Okay, so we talked a little bit, Jennifer mentioned the whole idea of kind of playing to everybody's strengths as opposed to your weaknesses. When we prep, one of the things that I think is the most important is looking at your scores. And yes, whatever's lowest needs to come up. We need to improve your weaknesses. But overlooking your strengths and how much higher those can go is a huge mistake. And I think a very common one with test prep. Because I see students come in, ACT, for what it's worth, is out of 36 points. To give you some equivalencies, with SAT being out of 1,600, a 30 on the ACT is roughly a 1,400 on the SAT. So I see students come in, and the English section's grammar section basically on ACT, and they have like a 29 on that, but they have like a 17 in math and a 21 on science. And the parents are like, we need to focus on math and science. It's like, true, but if you're scoring a 29 on grammar without any prep, we can get that to a near perfect score somewhat easily because you already have a really strong foundation. Now it's about fine tuning and saying, all right, do we need to go over things like who versus whom, or teach you how to use, dashes and semicolons and colons properly? What is it for you that's keeping you back? But you don't want to just go, that score is good enough, because on the ACT, they average your scores. So you have the English section, the math section, the reading section, and the science section. They're averaging all four to give you a composite. So yes, we want your math to be above a 17. National average is a 21 for what it's worth. That's considered kind of college readiness level. So once you exceed that, everything is just about getting as much as high as possible. But if you are really not great at math, the time, money, and energy that may have to be invested to get that math score really high will be a lot more than what it might be to get the same increase in English. So just don't overlook whatever you're good at, and recognize unless you're getting a perfect 800 or a perfect 36 on those sections, they can always be better. So play to your strengths and then keep focusing on the weaknesses. There's only a set number of math concepts and formulas that are tested. There's only a certain number of grammar rules that are on the test. So take the time to learn those. One thing to note, whenever you start prep, sometimes if people aren't sure which test they want to take, there's a couple different routes. So a lot of people have taken tests, through Compass or whomever at their school, and they have practice scores, which is great, but you don't want to make an assessment based off of just the scores, because a lot of people will say, well, this was slightly higher than the equivalent score on the SAT, so I'm going to go with this test. What matters most is actually what you can improve on the most quickly and most kind of efficiently and effectively, right? So we want something where when you review the questions and we show you what's right, you understand why it's right. And you're like, oh, I see that. SAT, a lot of my students just argue. And they're like, no, but I still like my answer. I was like, welcome to the frustration of the SAT, right? So you want to make sure that that's just something you're kind of keeping in mind, because you're not just taking 2 practice tests and picking one to go with it. You want to be able to actually look at it and go question by question and figure out why you're missing what you're missing, and therefore which one actually does play to your strengths and which one you actually understand the question types and the material on it. The material for grammar and math doesn't really change, except the SAT does have less geometry. So this is something, if somebody's terrible at geometry, this is one of the only other reasons that I sometimes say, let's look at SAT, because generally I feel like, as I've made probably clear, ACT is just easier to improve upon, right? So whatever that score is, we can just keep it going up. Most kids on ACT don't plateau. They just keep getting better with time and energy. If the more you prep, the better you're going to be. SAT, you're probably going to plateau. So it's something where whatever you're trying to review, there's a certain level of where it's just not worth it anymore sometimes for SAT, but maybe it got you to the score you want. And if you hate geometry, it's up to you to decide if you really want to review it to make the ACT a better test for you, which might be the smart thing. Or you might say, don't want to go there. I prefer the SAT, which doesn't have as much geometry. It's not a huge amount of a difference, but it's enough that if that's like the bane of your existence, you may still want to keep that in mind. Any questions about that? Any questions about what's on those tests or how they differ in any other way? All right. Oh, geometry. No, thank God, no proofs on the geometry section. That speaking of bane of my existence, that was mine. No, so they don't require proofs for the geometry stuff. It's going to be knowing how to find the area of a trapezoid, how to some trigonometry, which is somewhat algebra too, but obviously geometry based. There's, area of a circle compared to circumference. By the way, I'd say 75% of my kids get circumference and area backwards with pi r squared and 2 pi r. But it's memorizing those things and making sure you don't forget them, knowing how to draw a 30, 60, 90 triangle and what the angle measurements are and the ratios are of the sides. So there's a set amount of things you have to review, but there's definitely no proofs. Sine, cosine, and tangent for trig, absolutely. That is there, and that is not, I'd say prevalent, and it's actually more prevalent on ACT. And what's nice is if you know SOHCAHTOA, then you're good to go. I see, I've got the chat open now, Jennifer, obviously. I'm just like, I got this. So does the ACT give the formulas the way the SAT does during the test? No. So that is one thing to know, but the reality is there's not complicated formulas. So even though they don't give them to you, they are generally things like area of a circle, area of a triangle. They're not going to give you super complicated formulas. So anything that's too high level, they don't expect you to know, they'll give it to you. So for instance, a lot of questions that'll be about law of sine, law of cosine, which are higher level trigonometry, they'll go fact, law of sines equals, and then give you the equation. So they'll do that when there's a formula or a high level concept that they don't expect you to have memorized, but they expect you to know those fundamental concepts.
Can you talk a little bit about, can you talk a little bit about, I thought what you said was very interesting about students tend to plateau on the SAT, and then with time and effort, they continue to improve on the ACT. Is that because the SAT you talked about has these ambiguous answers?
Yeah, it's because you can only, and also from our side as tutors, we say there's only so much we can teach a kid how to approach a test, because if there's one passage they don't really understand, and a few questions that they're like, I don't know if she liked him or just tolerated him, and the narrative passage, you're going to get several questions wrong. Where ACT, everything is word for word in the text. So if you miss it, you just didn't see it, right? And it makes it easier because we can teach more speed reading drills and things like that of how do you get through the material faster. Frankly, you're treating it like a word search sometimes of looking for like red squirrels in that example of where do they mention it, right? SAT, it's just, you hit a certain point where you're usually going to be missing a couple things regardless. And ACT, I have kids, the improvement just comparatively it's to me night and day. Now, if somebody's starting near where they want to be for SAT, again, it's not, you can still improve, and you can still improve by a couple hundred points, but it depends on where you're starting and where you want to go. And knowing that ACT, it can be gradual, but it's going to be consistent growth usually and improvement. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so let's talk about timeline. Oh, one thing before we even talk about timeline, APs, because I want to talk about subject tests going to the wayside and no longer existing. So subject tests used to be called SAT-2s a few decades ago. They changed that about 2 decades ago. So SAT-2s or subject tests are basically mini final exams where if you have, you're taking chemistry, you would take the subject test in chemistry at the end of the year. And just like we said, trying to give a standardized test to compare apples to oranges, you would take the test, kids at other schools could take that test, and then it's basically a standardized final exam. So they could see what you actually learned from your chemistry class, whether you took regular, honors, or APs. They eradicated those. Those no longer exist as of a month ago, which some people are thrilled about because it's less testing. For me, if you're a strong student, they took away an opportunity to show you're a strong student. If you're a mediocre student or a student who's a great but doesn't love testing, then sure, it's fine to lose. But for those kids who are really whip smart and could have done very well, AP scores matter a ton now. So understanding that because you lost that opportunity, you could have a B in AP chemistry, but know way more than that kid who has an A in the class across the street at a different school. Right? Because how they're grading, I have students now who are saying, my teacher hasn't taught us anything about the exam. We're just learning basic material, and others who are being drilled like crazy. Those AP scores are the way that colleges can really assess what your grade means and how much you actually understand. And obviously APs come with other benefits. So yes, you're showing colleges you can do well on a college level course, right? So you're less of a liability and less of a risk if you show up on their campus and they're like, oh, he or she's already done really well on several college level classes in high school. She'll be fine 2 years later, right? That's what you want. If you struggle, now there's a question mark, right? Of like, well, can she handle this? Is this going to be a workload that's going to be acceptable? Can she work through it? You just want to make sure that those tests you don't take for granted because you have a good grade in the class. So recognize that your AP scores, like I said, now more than they did in the past, matter a lot. And frankly, more than ever before, just for the reasons we talked about at the beginning, is that there's less data and less information for colleges to go off of. They are looking at these. Any questions about APs? Okay. And just as added incentive to do well on it, I'm sure most of you know that you can also get college credit for them. And what's nice about that is you can either test into a higher level class. You can take a free, basically, and not have to take class that period. If you're going to take 5 courses that semester, take 4, right? And then you have an easier semester, or take a 5th class that's just for fun, or graduate early, right? There's a lot of ways you can use good AP scores to help you once you're in college. So they're worth the time and energy now. Timeline. So I know I'll speak kind of to the grade levels here. So juniors, I think there's a couple of you, if you're a junior, you want to start testing sooner rather than later. It's not urgent, but what you don't necessarily want to do is not know your scores before you're trying to figure out your college list. It's helpful to Jennifer to know what we're working with. So getting this where you're testing kind of by June, July is better. The latest you ever want to test is beginning of senior year. I don't like bleeding into senior year because not only is September, October running late and pushing back that knowledge of what you've scored, but it's also putting you in a position that if there's any issues at that test site or with your scores, they have up to 8 weeks to get you back your scores. It's usually 10 to 14 days, but they have 8 weeks. And I've seen test sites who, there's one in LA at Unity High School, they lost 400 ACTs in April, not last year, the year before, just lost them. They just went MIA, but they didn't tell people for 8 weeks. So people then missed the deadlines to register for all the next tests because they didn't want to acknowledge it. So I was like, you don't want to be in a position if you do that in this, fall of senior year, that's really stressful for everybody. So getting it done sooner, knowing there's always a chance there will be issues. And if there's any possible whiff of cheating at your entire test site, they will lock down the scores and go back to see who sat next to whom and who did they think was cheating or who went to the bathroom and talked about things. And it becomes like a legitimate investigation. And even if you had nothing to do with it and are in a different room, your scores are held until they get to the bottom of that. So this is a reason you want to get things out of the way as soon as possible with a buffer. Now, sophomores, talking about your timeline, I believe most, if not all of you are in Algebra 2. And if that's the case, you can start testing at the end of this year or start prepping to test, right? The reality is the math on these exams go through Algebra 2. There are some schools, just the way they break Algebra 2 trig to pre-calc, that sometimes there's a couple concepts that the teacher is like, we'll kick that till next year. We don't have time to cover it, or I don't want to cover it. I'll let the next teacher do it. But that's a couple things here and there. You know what you need to know as of this May or June when you're done with school. So, and same with grammar. I would say nobody's, as far as I know, has a grammar lesson coming in junior year. It's like you either learned it or you didn't at this point. So your grammar and your math, you're done learning. The reading comprehension, if you're taking SAT, if you're not a strong reader, well, if you're not a strong reader, you probably shouldn't be taking SAT because it is much denser. They pull, by the way, also literature from like the 1800s sometimes. So it's denser stuff on the SAT. But if you're not a strong reader, more time to get better at reading can help. ACT, it's so basic. It's not about that. It's about learning how to kind of speed read and skim and map a passage, which are different skills. You're not going to learn that junior year either. And then science, same thing, like we talked about, there's no outside knowledge there. So if you're in that position where you're done with Algebra 2 at the end of sophomore year, test. I would say I like to recommend that you prep over the summer, especially this summer, because with COVID, yes, it'll be better than last summer, but it's still not going to be super fantastic. It's like use this downtime, knock out test prep over the summer, take it in the late summer, early fall. Most kids take it 2 to 3 times. So this is just something to prepare for when you're looking at test dates. I always like to have people look at the calendar and when are the next, you want ones that are back to back, because if you have a big gap between test dates, you're either having to kind of, stall and then pick back up frantically and refresh everything, or you're going to have to keep prepping, which is very expensive if you have a 6-month gap. So you want things that are kind of back to back. So if you take, a September test, let's say you take July, then September is the next one. Most of them are every other month. And I see the question about when are test dates. It depends on if it's SAT or ACT. So for instance, ACT this year is February, April, June, July, September, October, December. And then SAT is March, May, June, August, October, maybe November and December. And with COVID, they're talking about adding new test dates to make up for old ones, all of that. So when you're looking at your schedule and trying to figure out which test dates, the other thing to keep in mind is that you can super score, which you're on it. You're beating me to this. So super scoring is something that makes it really beneficial to have a couple back-to-back things. What that means is that if you take the ACT twice or the SAT twice, and your grammar or your reading are really strong on the first one, but you miss bubble on the second one, but your math's really good on the second test date, you can take your grammar or your reading from the first test date and your math from the second test date. So here's the one caveat to this, and this is where it gets a little confusing. When you're on the actual college application, especially on the Common App, the way it's done is it'll say, what was your greatest English score? What test date? And what was the score? So you would say, like, I got a 32 on the March 14th exam, right? Then say, what was your greatest math test date? And you would do the same thing. But then it asks, what was the date of your highest composite score? And that is your score from one test date. So they're looking at, you could officially, just to kind of give an example, let's say you took the ACT 4 times. One time you got a perfect 36 in one section and like 20s on all the others. Next time you got a perfect 36 in one of the other sections, and you're like alternating. So you could put best score in each of the 4 sections is 36, 36, 36, 36, but your composite still may be like a 25, right? However, colleges super score. So even though the application is currently laid out that way, admissions officers, almost all of them at this point, because of test optional, are super scoring. And what that means is that they're going to ignore that composite from a single test date, and they're going to reconfigure your super score score. For the sophomores, I'm hesitant to say that's going to be a for sure thing for you, because that goes along with test optional. Because if you're going to be flexible about whether kids can send scores, of course you're flexible about super scoring, but it just depends. So recognize that that should be the case. That's the most common case, but not every school necessarily lets you do that. And same with SAT. Super scoring is very common through most schools. Most universities accept it because, again, it helps their statistics, right? They can go to US News and World Report and say, look at how high our scores are. And they actually did the mixing and matching to super score that. So, but that's why taking 2 test dates is always a good thing. No matter what you get the first time, I recommend testing a second time if you can, because there's also a curve in play. So the national average, SAT doesn't curve as much as the ACT does. ACT, there's a very severe curve, which can be very beneficial, or it can hurt you depending on how many brilliant people or not so brilliant people in America are testing the same day as you. So they keep the national average at a 21. And so if you find yourself in a position where, I always tell my students, if you walk out and say that math section was easy, that's not good. Because if the rest of America thought it was easy, the curve is going to curve you down, because they need to keep that national average at a certain point. It would be too high. But the other way it works just as truly, and I see tests sometimes where they miss 7 questions and they had a 35. So they only lost 1 point for 7 questions. It's because they put too many hard questions on there. No one knew how to answer them. And the curve compensated for that. So taking it twice allows you not only to improve on the first one, if there's anything that you specifically want to improve on, but also just seeing if with the different curve, even getting the same number of questions right, if you could get a better score. If you don't need to tell colleges about it, right? But there's no downside. 3 times to me is the max. If you take more than that, even if you're super scoring and they see 4 different test dates, you do start to look a little crazy, because it's also very evident how much effort you've put into these scores. So it doesn't look like a really natural assessment of your abilities when you're super scoring from too many dates. So to me, 3 is kind of the max. 3 is fine, but don't go more than that. Another thing is, don't start testing until you're ready for that reason. Now, you could have a couple that you just don't count, right? If you take one and it's terrible, you don't have to super score off that one. But if you do pick any section score from a test, then they know you tested that month, right? So they can see all of that. Now, when we're talking about kind of all of the super scoring, the curve, this is just points to say, look, there's always exceptions. Sometimes the curve, again, is going to hurt or help you. Some schools let you super score or don't. But just go into this thinking you're testing twice, no matter what. 3rd time is the backup. If you are, again, done with Algebra 2, I do recommend, if you can start this summer, it's better. You can always wait till fall. If you want to enjoy summer and take a break and actually get out and see friends and have a bit of a normal life after everything with COVID, you're absolutely welcome to. That's no problem. You're not going to be behind. But what I think is really nice about starting in the summer is if you, let's say you prep for let's give you June off. You take June off, July, August, you prep, you test in September, you maybe test again in October, and then 3rd, if you need it, is December. So worst case scenario, you're done before the holidays of junior year. That eliminates so much pressure and stress from junior year, which is already the most stressful year by far. You have the hardest classes, the grades matter the most. And then 2nd semester, you're going to have potentially AP exams final exams that you're prepping for. If you can be done before 2nd semester junior year, you're going to be very, very happy. And again, the sooner you start prepping, the sooner you can be done testing. I have plenty of students who are done in August or September at the beginning of junior year, because they really prepped hardcore over the summer and maybe even did July and September as test dates, right? So I think keeping that in mind. Jennifer, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, just so everyone's really clear, as the sophomore families, for sure, the way that I do this when I work with your families, and some of my junior families have been through this before, is I do ask you to take a PACT, a practice ACT, and a practice SAT. It's free everywhere right now. I know Jen's company offers it, but it's free everywhere. Sometimes your schools are offering it. That will be step one. Step two then will be to make an appointment with Jen, and you will pre-send her the detailed score reports, as she has mentioned, not just the final numbers, just exactly all the details. And then she will have a free 30-minute conversation with you discussing which test she really feels is best for your personal situation. That's step two. Then step three, then we talk about, okay, now you've decided on the ACT. Okay, let's sign you up for test dates to make sure you get the test dates that you want, and then we'll start test prep, however that may look. I've got families on this call from all the San Francisco to San Diego. So, however, that plays out, that part of it all plays out. But I just want everyone on the call to understand kind of my like 3-step process of how I work with this. But Jen is essential step to help you have a private conversation on which way really to go.
Yeah. And also, like, I talked about at the very beginning, looking at your strengths and weaknesses and going through it. And, when I get those detailed score reports, I can see the codes of the test you've taken. And I have all the tests and I've taken them all a million times. So I can look at it and be like, oh, you struggled with the passage that was about this, right? Or you really struggled with a lot more of the geometry questions, which I feel like is wasted brain space for me somewhat, but I can glance at those and like help you really understand where those weaknesses might be, and talk to you also with like, were you just tired that day, or were you in a bad mood when you took it and it just wasn't a great representation? Or do you think it was a great representation of where you're at? Because I think that's important. I see the question about if you're starting from a lower score, how much time should you allow to prep? Here's the deal. I always say there's 2 ways prep works. One is that it's all refresher, and one is that we're teaching a lot for the first time. And this simply depends on how your teachers have taught you. So grammar is the perfect example. Most students have not actually learned grammar, right? They have maybe a good ear, they've read a lot, and they might have good grammar, but then I get the students who are picking answers because it sounds good. That will destroy you on these tests, because they know what sounds good and they know what you're going to like, and they know that you put commas where you want to pause because you want to take a breath, and that's not how you use commas. So there's things like that where we want to look at this and kind of figure out, if we're teaching you grammar or if we're just refreshing you, you actually learned it in the past. And math is the big one, because you've got 4 years of math that's being tested on this. Some kids, when we look at a problem and they got it wrong, it's like, oh, that's right, I forgot that formula, that's why I got it wrong. Other kids look at it like, I never learned that. Like, I have no idea what they're talking about here. And that's what we would need to know how long it's going to take to prep, because obviously teaching you new information takes a lot longer than just reviewing concepts. So SAT, ACT, our tests are not offered at the same times. They are offered they're always on different days, and they're usually on different months. So there's only a couple of months they actually overlap, but even so, they're different weekends. That being said, you will never want to prep for both at the same time. Right. This is the biggest thing I can take, is so many kids are like, well, I'll just prep for both and take both. It's like, that's not a thing, because the strategies are so different. If anything, if you really want to give both a shot, which honestly I don't usually recommend, because I think picking one and really making sure it's the right one is the best way to go. But if you're a family that really is like, let's just try both, you always want to start with ACT, because ACT is more straightforward. So all of the material you review for ACT applies to SAT, right? So everything we've covered, nothing's wasted. We just apply it. You need to know how to find the area of a trapezoid on both tests. So that's why ACT is better to start. If you started with SAT and then suddenly decided to switch to ACT, half the strategies are irrelevant, because it's, again, testing what's best, not what's right. And that's a very different approach. So I think being just aware of that, you want to pick one. So even the fact that they're not in conflict with each other should in some ways be irrelevant, because you wouldn't want to be taking them close together. For me, the only time I really see kids switch from ACT to SAT is if they really can't speed up enough to get the score they need to if they just can't complete the number of questions. But with time comes familiarity. With familiarity comes speed, right? The more you understand the test and recognize what they're asking, you're going to go faster. So that usually fixes itself with time. Yep. What other questions on that? One thing that we didn't cover that I did want to go back to real quick is the official PSAT. So the official PSAT that the College Board puts out, generally in non-COVID years, it's mid-October. There's one date that your school will offer it to do, like October 16th or 14th or things like that. That's usually the formal date for juniors. So those of you who are sophomores, that date will be coming up in the fall. That test is only relevant if you can test in the top 3%. And even then, the scores don't go to colleges, but the scores put you on the radar. So you'll start getting mail and emails from schools that like whatever your score was. But so if you're top like 96th percentile, no one cares. No one will ever know. 97th percentile, you might be a national merit semifinalist. If you can get into the top 1%, you're a national merit finalist. And then there's money, there's prestige, there's recognition. Some college applications ask, were you a national merit finalist or semifinalist? So if you're a strong tester and can check those boxes, that's great. For the rest of you, don't worry about it. So like Jennifer was saying, you want to take a practice SAT and a practice ACT, but the official PSAT that's offered is not necessarily relevant to most people. So it's only if you're in that really top level of testers. That's it. And then, I know Jennifer touched on this too. For setting meetings, like I said, we do the 30-minute consultations. I'll chat with you. You send me the scores. We'll talk to your son or daughter, and I can kind of say, look, this is roughly what we think from a time perspective, what she needs to focus on, but also having him or her there to tell me what they feel like are big weaknesses, or again, if it's an accurate assessment of where they're at. And if for any reason your students look at their scores and go, that's not an accurate assessment, I didn't sleep the night before, and I was in a bad mood in a fight with my girlfriend when I went in to take the test and wasn't focused, then they need to take another one, because the prep will be based on what they're missing on that test. And if that's just them being lazy and not just bubbling answers because they're bored, it's not a good, assessment of anything. So I would have that candid conversation also to make sure that everyone believes that was, a legitimate kind of thing. Because a lot of kids don't take those seriously because they don't matter in theory, right? So, but yeah, and then we can kind of come up with a game plan. I don't know, Jennifer, have these lovely families seen the discounts, or we're going to send that to them later?
No, I don't know if they have.
Okay.
I'll send that to them. No, I don't think they have. I'll send that to them at the.
Yeah, so we also just offer discounts to you guys for working with Jennifer. It's fabulous. And so it's a great partnership, but there's discounts and everything there, and she'll send you that. And we do offer free SAT and ACT proctored exams on weekends. So if there's one you have not tried and you want to try that other one, or you want to retake one that you already took but feel like was not a good assessment, then reach out to us and we can get that coordinated for you.
And I'll send out an email tomorrow and make sure everyone has Jen's information for that. The other thing that actually wasn't brought up with this group, but and this is really not for a year from now, but I just think it's a question that was brought up that I thought last time that I thought was a really important question, was how do the colleges get your ACT scores or your SAT scores? And I get this question all the time. And we talked about super scoring, like how do you do all that? So the answer is, it is the student's job to go to the College Board or go to the ACT website, and they have to send the colleges their scores from that site, right? They just because you took the test doesn't mean automatically, well, it can when you sign up, but I don't think these families are going to do that, but because I wouldn't recommend it. You can, when you're signing up, you can get 4 free colleges. You can send off 4 free colleges, but please, I'm going to tell you, please don't do that. So anyways, it is your responsibility or your child's responsibility at that time to send the scores. There's a whole thing, and we will go through it in a year from now. But I just want you to know they kind of just don't magically appear at the colleges. There actually have to be buttons pushed on your end for that to happen.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, she said it perfectly, but to reiterate this, that you might save $50 by getting those 4 free score reports when you sign up, and it might be nice to save $50. It is not worth it, because the number of students I've seen who missed bubbles or ran out of time when they normally don't, and those scores just went to all their top schools, right? So now those scores are gone, you can't pull them back, and you didn't know that you missed bubbled ahead of time, right? So always, in my opinion, if you can financially afford to lose that $50 of free stuff, do it. It's not worth the risk of sending them something bad. Have the control. So when you're working with Jennifer in the fall of senior year, you can pick and choose what you're sending.
Right. Exactly.
So, oh, and one thing on that note that I think is also worth mentioning, the difference between SAT and ACT, and this can always change. This is something that I keep waiting for it to change, and it hasn't yet. So the way SAT works, College Board has an agreement with each university or college about what they want, whether they want super score, whether they want one single test date, whether they want all of your scores from your record. Whatever their agreement is with that university, you have no control over. So if they tell College Board they want to see everything your kid's ever done, everything will go. You have no say in that. So SAT does not give you any control over that, to be honest. That's just, like I said, it's a back end thing. The reason is that if you pay $13 to send your scores, they're like, great, we'll send everything for that $13 to whichever schools want whatever they want. ACT will charge you $13 per test date to send scores. So what that means is that if, let's just say you take it in April and you miss bubble and things doesn't go well, your score's horrible, they don't need to know what ever happened, because you don't need to pay $13 to send that score. They're never going to share that for you for free unless you unfortunately signed up for that initial free thing. So that's another benefit to ACT in my mind, is that you have control. Again, this can always change, but for the last 15 years, that's how this has worked. And you have that say. Another trend is that colleges are not requiring scores until after you're accepted. 3 years ago, everyone wanted it ahead of time. 2 years ago, so it's going on the application. You're filling it out. What they're saying is that if we accept you based on these scores, now you send us proof that you got it. But so obviously you can't BS that. That has to be true. But it's also negating that risk of sending things you don't want to send at the schools that are saying, just tell us what your scores are. And then if we accept you and you come, you can send us proof. And then it doesn't matter if you had all these bad scores they see as well, because they've already accepted you based on the good ones. But that is also a trend that's happening with the way they're accepting test scores.
Hi, it's Elizabeth. I have a quick question. To go back what Jennifer mentioned about the student's responsibility to send in the test scores. So can you just kind of go back of how that works, like the paid or the, I'm not really quite, I don't really quite understand that part. Like you get the 4 free score reports and it gets generated if you don't pay. Can you just kind of go back on that?
Sure. Jennifer, do you want to take this one?
Go ahead.
Okay. So the idea is when you register for the test, so like, let's say you're going to sign up for the June exam and you get online tonight to sign up for the June exam, there will be an option while you're registering that says, would you like 4 free score reports? Tell us what colleges you know you're applying to. And you'll enter that information. That's what you don't want to do, because that way you're getting them for free.
Okay, I got it.
Getting to sending those scores without knowing what they are. What happens generally is that come fall, when you're actually applying to college, then you're going to pick and choose what you want. And the schools that are requiring you to send official scores, you will log back on to those websites, the College Board or ACT website, and say, I'm going to give you $13 to send this score to that university. Does that make a little more sense?
Perfect. Thank you. That makes sense. I missed it. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you for asking the question. There's a lot of information on this webinar. It's a lot. So that was a great question. Thank you. Does anyone, we've got 5 minutes. That was just such a wealth of knowledge, Jen. Thank you so much.
I didn't talk too fast. I was trying to cram it all in. So.
Got so much in, but the good news is that this is a super set of families. So everyone's going to ask questions in the process when we get there.
Excellent.
Does anybody have any last questions before we leave? Good. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you so much, Jen and Jen. Jen and Jen. Thank you.
Jen and Jen.
Yeah, sure.
Very helpful.
Good. Yeah, so Jen, go ahead. We had a question. Thank you, Charlene, about your services. So if you'd like to talk about your services, now is the time you may do so.
Perfect. Excellent. So the way we function is we have packages. So everything is packages of hours. We have starting at 15 hours, which is basically enough to cover the basics on each test. So that's like a whirlwind review of all the math concepts, grammar rules, math, or reading and science strategies, things like that. So 15 hours is enough to basically review those things. If somebody has if 15 hours is your budget and somebody's exceptional at math, we can skip math if you want to. But again, like we talked about, if it's your strength, sometimes we don't want to skip it. But the packages are the 15, 30, 45, 60, 75 hours. You don't usually need the higher. Those are more for people who are doing multiple things. But we do also do AP prep. So if anybody, we have AP tutors on staff who have specializations in different subjects. So if at any point you're trying to do SAT or ACT prep and any kind of AP, then larger packages might be a better fit. But a lot of it just depends on where your score is and where you want it to be. But then, like we talked about, why you're missing what you're missing. Is it that you just forgot some things and need to brush up, or that you've never learned it? So that's one thing we can talk about, is like which packages would be a better fit for you based on what you need. And of course, if you have a budget, we'll work within that budget as best we can and figure out how to maximize that time, money, and energy. So, and then with the 30-minute free consultations, the whole idea is to establish all of that. But we also do, like I said, we have the free proctored exams if you want to try them. Another option is, if you want, you can do that and then get a couple free hours of tutoring to review those in depth. So a lot of people who have not taken an SAT or ACT, we encourage taking a practice test and meeting with a tutor for a couple hours that next week to go question by question and literally see why you're missing what you're missing on every single question, to see if there's patterns, to see what's going on. And that way, if you're not sure how many hours you need, that's a good way to determine it. But if you kind of have a general sense of where you're scoring, feel like it's an accurate assessment, we can generally kind of estimate what you'll need without doing that, as long as that practice test was kind of a legitimate effort. So, and so you do, okay, see the question, if you run out of the 15 hours, we absolutely offer hourly, but the best part is whatever, so our hourly rate drops the larger the package. So our individual hour rates are technically higher than package rates, but once you purchased a package, that's the highest hourly rate you'll ever pay. So right now, for instance, we have, and she'll send you all this information, but we have something called Classic. The rates there, individual hours are $195, and then packages are $135 to $175, depending. So if you buy 15 hours, you're paying $175, and if you need 3 more hours after that, you just tack on it to $175. The office will honor that same hourly rate.
Appreciate that a lot. That's really great.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you again, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. I'm so grateful. And to everyone else, I hope you have a great evening.